As many of you may know, I am an English teacher by trade, and my specific course, AP Language and Composition, makes it so that writing is always on my mind. The instruction of writing, the assessment of writing, and everything in between. So my goal, my focus in research is to focus on the assessment and measurement of taking an abstract and nuanced skill like composition and making it more concrete. Why composition? I mentioned before in some of my posts that assessing writing is time consuming for the teacher and also for the student. The student has to go back and read teacher feedback, and sometimes the feedback isn't as timely as students would like, and so the application gets lost. Additionally, the subjectivity of writing and the assessment of writing harbors a comparison between students, between teachers, and sometimes it makes scores feel less valid in students' minds because it is subjective. I also believe that composition is one of the most practical and poignant life skills students leave my classroom with, and we also want to lead the groundwork to secondary education. Once students get to college, they rarely will write multiple drafts, turn those in for revisions. It's all dependent on the student to go through that process, him or herself. So I want to create those great habits of peer reflection, self-reflection, while they're in this secondary setting. Peer and self-assessment are the specific area of focus I want to talk about. I've done a bit of research about peer trust and reliability. Sometimes if students have relationships or don't have relationships with students in their class, that could impact how they view feedback and scores given to one another. There's also a question about the accuracy of scoring and feedback. If you have one student who is a highly skilled writer and one who is still an emerging writer, sometimes that disparity between skill leads to inaccuracies. It's important for teachers to monitor these peer and self-assessments versus having the intensive practice of doing it all myself or ourselves. And the goal is to create self-reliant individuals, self-reliant community members. So if these students can leave my classroom with the skill to do this on their own when there's not a teacher with red ink looking over their shoulders, then I have been successful. So what are my specific research questions at this moment? Well, I have 3 that are on the screen. The first is as follows. How effective are peer and self-edits in improving the summative result on composition performance assessments? So I've used peer assessments, I've used self-assessments, but how do we know if they're actually working? The second question is what specific method or methods of formative assessments yield the greatest growth in student composition? So provided that these formative components actually have an impact on the summative, what are the best methods to yield that greatest growth? And lastly, are scores gathered through peer and self-assessment valid and accurate? Sort of speaks for itself. I've gathered some preliminary research. The first source that I found did a comparison between peer editing practices and self-editing practices. This study was done in an undergraduate situation. It was English foreign language learners, 95 student sampling, and it was an online system. Students gave self-corrections, and they also engaged in peer evaluation. And as they went, they were asked to reflect in action and reflect on action. So reflect while they're going through the process and reflect after the process. The data was collected over a series of a couple of months, so it's kind of a small sampling, kind of a small span of time. But what's interesting is that the results basically stated that both editing processes have value, but they have different value. And so it's important to engage in both practices. Students reported that when self-editing, the growth, the comments were more on grammar conventions, usage, mechanical things, whereas peer editing allowed them to focus on the broader implications, like understanding one another's perspectives, understanding the nuance of an argument, and seeing things from another's eyes. I also researched kind of the power of a peer evaluation, whether or not there actually is value in doing that practice. In this particular study, the teacher, and this was a sampling of students grades 6 through 12, gave direct instruction on how to proofread, which is very, very important. You might think that your students know how to give constructive feedback because they too have received it, but without actually teaching them and giving them the skills, you can't expect them to be successful proofreaders. But in doing this, the teacher identified 11 essential parts for any written work, so they gave the students specific guidelines to look for. Students were given anonymous samples to try to practice applying those skills to hone their craft, and then they went to actually evaluate each other's papers, and they used a score sheet, and both the assignment itself and their evaluation was graded, which gave students onus, incentive to really work on creating meaningful evaluations, because that too was calculated into their grade. The results of the study found that there was an increase in student writing, and there was also a decrease in teacher grading time, which was a nice bonus. The last source that I found to date talks about the validity of peer assessment. So we've talked about different practices. Now, are they actually accurate? This one was definitely near and dear to my heart because this 2016 study focused on AP, or Advanced Placement Classroom. The focus was to, again, decrease demand on teacher time and improve student writing. And it wanted to test this claim that peer feedback lacks validity. Do peers really know what they're talking about, especially in a class where you have high flyers, advanced learners? What the study did was created a student-friendly version of the College Board Scoring Guide. So the College Board Scoring Guide scores essays from 1 to 9, and they are holistic. The language, the jargon is a little bit elevated, not as student-friendly, so they broke it down a little bit to make it layman. And then they had students apply this scoring guide to various essays. And the data, surprisingly, excitingly found that student assessment can even be more valid than that of a single instructor, and equally valid as AP scorers, which is so, so, so exciting. Thank you so much for taking time to learn a little bit about the research that I've done and the research I will continue to do. I am excited and a little daunted by this task of looking at more about peer and self-evaluations, but there's so much out there to be learned and gleaned and applied in my classroom.